Welcome to Black and Psych, and thank you for coming to our event today. Who is Black and Psych? Black and Psych is a platform to promote visibility, community, and networking opportunities between Black professionals and trainees across the field of psychology. We seek to celebrate, amplify, and support Black voices in psychology and to encourage dialogue around the intersections of psychology, race, social justice, and equity. What we are here for. The Black and Psych organization is founded to 1. Promote the visibility of Black professionals and trainees in the field of psychology, 2. Create a community and network of established and aspiring Black psychologists for connection and future collaboration, and 3. Encourage and hold a space for dialogue around the intersections of psychology, race, social justice, and equity. Who we are here for. Black and Psych is founded to promote visibility, community, and networking opportunities between Black professionals and trainees across the field of psychology, inclusive of all intersectional identities. This is Black and Psych's current team, and you're currently hearing from the current president, Lauren Kendall Brooks. If you're interested in joining our team, please send an email to blackandsych@gmail.com, visit our website at blackandsych.org, or follow us on Twitter or Instagram. Also, the QR code listed on the right side of your screen will also take you directly to our website. Thank you, and I hope you would really enjoy today's seminar.
I'm here to talk about critical constructivist grounded theory research. So this is a kind of qualitative research. And this is a picture of my book. And what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about like what is critical constructivist grounded theory, what is grounded theory, what is constructivist, what is critical, and give some examples of what this might look like in projects in terms of research aims and questions. And we'll talk about some of the main steps of this analysis and some perspectives and you'll get a little bit of a chance to practice some skills. So I'll talk a little bit about methodological integrity at the end, and then we'll have hopefully some time for Q&A. So that's kind of the our outline for today. And oh yeah, so I already had a very nice introduction. Thank you very much, Jocelyn and Kimberly, for that. And so I guess just some things about me to add is that I do a lot of LGBTQ and psychotherapy research. And so in my in that research, I'm really interested in doing work looking at different kinds of identities and different kinds of ways LGBTQ status interact with other kinds of identities like racial identities and ethnic identities and etc. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and also in my psychotherapy, I do a lot of psychotherapy research, so you may see me draw upon that also in this talk. Okay, so I thought I would start off by asking you all a question, which is, what is your background coming into this course? So I thought maybe you could write and see. I don't know if I can see the chat responses, but Jocelyn or Kimberly, can you see them when they come up? Okay, so we'll try it. So if you could enter in either A, I have not learned about qualitative methods yet. So this is like a initial or early time. I've learned about them in lectures here and there, but I haven't taken a course. Or C for I've taken a course on one method, but I haven't used them. Or D, I haven't taken a course, but I've used these methods. And E, I've both taken a course and used qualitative methods. So maybe put in your responses. Oh, I see. I can
Okay.
here. All right. So there's a lot of C's and D's, a lot of C's, which is kind of cool to see, right? So some people have used qualitative methods who haven't even taken the course, and some people have done both. So this is um, awesome. adjunct faculty member, welcome. Um, so you're all, so I'm not seeing tons of A's. So you're all kind of an informed audience, which is wonderful. I love it. Um, and so, uh, and so, so I'll keep this in mind, right, as we talk. So you may be familiar then with some qualitative methods, and this is, I'll be talking a lot about grounded theory research, which was one of the earlier qualitative methods to come into psychology. 1967, the sociologists Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss together developed this grounded theory research method. And they did it because they were really concerned that there was a lot of experiments that were testing hypotheses, but there wasn't a lot of attention, or very, very like little, if any, attention on how do you develop a good hypothesis? How do you develop a good theory that's actually worth testing? And the importance of doing that before you spend, lots of money and lots of time on a clinical trial, right? Or some sort of experimental uh, research. And so they developed this method as a way of developing theory, right? And really what they're meaning is like developing hypotheses, developing a grounding for further research. So it doesn't need to be like a big, huge theory. It could just be like an understanding of something, right? Or um, uh, uh, a clearer picture of how something works in the world, right? That will let you then continue on in your research, or could be the foundation for other kinds of research. And their method was really written, very much so in 1967, right? To people who mostly didn't know about qualitative research. And so they're using a lot of language that's super quantitative sounding if you read it now. But at the time, they were trying to talk to people who didn't know what this was at all. And they were trying to use language that would like be familiar to them and make them interested. Um, but since then, there's been other people who have developed other versions of grounded theory. So and also the two original founders started having disagreements on what the method should look like. So this resulted in like a number of different kinds of grounded theory, um, uh, classic and emerged or evolved grounded theory. Um, between the founders. And then there's a version of realist grounded theory. Probably the most popular in psychology has been constructivist grounded theory, which was developed by Kathy Sharmaz in 2006. Um, Adele Clark developed this situational analysis, which is sort of adding charts to grounded theory to try to understand like what's happening in society. How does the experience you're studying look like in different realms of society? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. But so these are all based on different kinds of epistemological assumptions, which mean epistemological means what's important in terms of the way we know things. And so it could be what's important is our observations, or what's important is our cultural understandings, or what's important is our internal emotional understanding. So the different versions sort of emphasize different kinds of pictures. But all of them are using a similar kind of process that guides researchers to organize data in a similar way. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit too. Um, and so that's what makes it grounded theory, even though there are these different versions. And the type that I'm talking about is really building on probably constructivist grounded theory, I think is by far the approach that has been used the most historically. But then I've developed this critical constructivist grounded theory that's based in some work by David Rennie. And the point of it is to take grounded theory and make it more appropriate for studying things tied to power, tied to oppression and privilege, tied to uh, sociological systemic kinds of phenomena. And so this is adding a little bit of a different twist. So here, let's talk a little bit about what is constructivist and what is critical to make that make more sense. So when we talk about constructivist qualitative research, um, even the original version is very appealing to constructivists because they're really interested in how do we create meaning socially? How do we develop an understanding of what something is, right? So if we want to understand um like what is it to be Black in psych, right? We might talk to some people in this call. We might say, like, look inside, like, what does it feel like? What are your feelings inside? How do you think about it? How do you And we might be interested in, like, how did you develop that understanding? How did you develop that feeling? Where did that come from, right? So these are constructivist ideas. We're interested in the how you built up your understanding, right? And looking across participants, looking across maybe different data sources. We could have students who are Black in psych. We had faculty members who are Black in psych. We can look at different people, and how they may potentially co-construct. So even within your group, you may be co-constructing new meanings about what it means to be Black in psych, right? Just even amongst yourselves, because you have had all these conversations and webinars. And so this is like constructivist. Like, how did the meaning evolve? How did it come from really looking within people and within their interpersonal dynamics? Um, so when we think about critical qualitative research, we're thinking more about at the societal level, the social level. And and so Clark, as an example, developed like diagrams to have different pictures of, well, so we could say, how does being Black in psych influence you? There may be many spheres of influence, right? It could influence you in the classroom. It could influence you at conferences. It could influence you in hiring, in like looking for jobs. It could influence you in taking, like, in offering classes. So there could be many different ways that many different spheres, and it's sort of developing like a diagram or a map of what this looks like. Critical researchers are really interested in socio-political structures. So how does privilege work in society? How does it work in psychology? How does marginalization work? And are really interested in developing findings that not only shed light on how meaning develops, but that are emancipatory. So our goal is to, like, develop findings that are actually challenging status quo, that are furthering social justice. And this is a core of what the goal is for critical qualitative research. So if you're evaluating this research, you want to see that that research is doing something that's going to advance the cause that's being investigated. Okay. Um, there's many, so this gives you a little bit of a sense of critical and constructivist. And so here in this model, we're really looking at both, which gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of kinds of questions we want to look at, because we're often interested in both how something feels inside and in our more intimate relationships, as well as how something appears in a social kind of way, right? In a systemic kind of way. And so, um, and so there's many different kinds of purposes for this kind of research. So people have used it to develop understandings of how an experience is shaped, or understandings of what an identity group means, or what an oppressive practice looks like, how it could be responded to. People sometimes will, because we'll talk about how we develop a hierarchy, which sort of has different, organizes data in different categories. That could be used to develop like multimodal educational lesson plans, or treatments, or trainings. We've used this kind of method to develop items for measures that we've developed, stage models, principles for practice. People will do qualitative meta-analysis out of it, and also to develop theory, right? Which is in the name. But I think people sometimes don't realize that there's many things you can do in addition to developing theory with this method. So I'm going to talk a little bit about data collection and interviewing and give you a little bit of a sense of that. Uh, as you're engaging in data collection, you're thinking about how do I interview? It's often interview based. In psychology, we tend to be very interview based, but you don't have to be interview based, right? You could decide you're going to look at other kinds of narratives or advertisements. I remember being on a committee of a student who looked at slave narratives. You could look at, I've been on a committee with students who look at advertisements in terms of how different products are being positioned, right? And so there could be very many different things that you do that are not interviews, but we typically in psychology are we love interviews. And I think we love interviews for a good reason, right? Because it's fun to interview people. You can ask more questions, right? If you're reading something and you have a question about something, you can't get the more data about what that was about. But in an interview, you can. So it's super fun in that way. But depending on what your question is, you do whatever is appropriate. And people are typically using semi-structured interviews. Questions that we're developing are usually thinking about if we're trying to ask questions, we're wanting to be constructivist and understand how something means. We want to ask questions about meanings. We want to ask questions about intentions. We want to ask questions about people's experiences with each other. And in that process, we're aware that our questions are influencing what our findings are going to be. So we have to be super aware as researchers. You have to think about what is it that I'm really wanting to know? You have to think about what are my assumptions, right? Because your assumptions may guide the questions that you ask. And what is it that I don't know? What are things that I need to learn? What are ways that my assumptions could interfere with the questions that I ask, right? Because for each of us, if let's say we're interviewing participants, our participants will have some things that are similar to our experiences and some things that are different from our experiences. And so we're going to want to be very carefully thinking about not putting our experiences onto them, right? Or expecting that even if they have a lot of similarities with us, they may still have different experiences or interpretations through their lives. And so we often use memoing, journaling. We talk in our research teams a lot about who we are, what we expect, why we expect that, what we might be missing, who we might need to consult with, or what participants we might need to bring in or co-researchers that could bring different ideas to our data collection. And thinking about exploring data, being aware of the context of that experience, right? Because it could be very different if you're having an experience in your family than if you're having an experience at a public event, right? So thinking about what are those dynamics, and remembering to analyze the data in relation to the context that it's unfolding in. And really thinking about recruiting participants that have insight and that can share experiences. The more experience, the more insight that they have about the thing you're interested in, the better, right? So I've had people say to me, oh, well, I'm going to do a study. I want to interview people who have been married a long time about what it's like to not be divorced. And that's a tricky thing because they haven't been divorced. So how can they talk about what it's like to not be divorced, right? And so really thinking about you're wanting to ask people who really have lived that thing that you are interested in studying, right? Um, so we're thinking about people who will have a lot to who will have a lot to offer and also who have diversity within the people. So we want to have people who have different experiences that they bring. And here we're thinking about the critical lens is really helpful. So thinking about my own positionality as a researcher. So I think about, who am I? So if I'm doing a study working with um, trans women, I have to be very careful because I'm a queer person, but I'm not a trans woman. And so I have to think about like, what do I not know? How would my positionality influence that interview? How would that make my participant feel? Right? And what do I need to do to make that feel comfortable? Um, I have to think about, do I have any assumptions, right, that I need to be pushing myself on? Uh, I like to think about people who are sort of the dominant people, but also people who may be on the margins, who may be less dominant in the spaces that you're in. So here, often if I'm doing research on LGBTQ people, I don't want to only do research on LGBTQ people. I want to think about LGBTQ people who come from different positions racially and ethnically and in terms of their social economic status. And I want to think about different positions depending on the thing I'm studying. What are things that are less common, right? Where people might have different experiences than whatever is the dominant narrative that's been produced for that set of people. And and so this is a really helpful thing to think about because it'll help you see how power is working in that group of people or in that system or with that question. Um, Thinking about ethics, so thinking about the demands on your participants. So sometimes when I'm developing a study with students, students will be like, well, it would be great if I could interview these people like 3 times. But that's a lot of time, right? And depending on the participants that you're interviewing, like that may be harder or less hard, right? And so thinking about um, what are the ethics, right? In terms of what are the demands you're making? How can you make it as easy as possible for people to participate in research, right? Are there risks that they're taking, right? So if we're doing research on around immigration, are there risks that people um, may feel or may have, and what do I need to do to reduce those risks? Recruiting people who are located recruiting participants or co-researchers who will help me have more insight. Whatever your positionality is, there are probably people who have the experiences you're studying that have different positionalities, different experiences. And sometimes it can really help to think, oh, I'm going to make sure I have someone who's a co-researcher who will be able to bring these things and I bring these things, right? Um, okay. So a note on qualitative interviewing ethics. Sometimes it's really helpful to think about the what it means to develop trust with the community, right? And sometimes people will work with a community for a long, long time, developing connection, developing trust. So we did my partner and our research team did research when I was at the University of Memphis, but we continued on it. Probably we were involved in this community that was mostly African American, um, trans women, and gay men. It was a house family community. They had different houses and families. And we worked with them for about 10 years. And so we had different meetings with them and we had we did different lectures for the community and we um, engaged with them at the beginning of projects and then we did work to try to get resources for the community. And so we tried to do a lot of things to be supportive of the community and to be around over time, right? We developed videos with the community. We had a party um, at a club, and we did a bunch of different things. So thinking about what that means for your community, right, to develop trust can be really important so that people feel comfortable talking with you. Also, having co-researchers from the community can be super helpful. Uh, Being sure to review consent agreements together before the interview. So You'd always want to be doing that. You'd want to have your research approved by your IRB board at your university. Thinking about power differences, thinking about how to help people feel comfortable. So, as an example, I remember when I was doing research with religious leaders, right, in the South. And so they were religious leaders of big congregations. And I came into every meeting wearing like a suit with my hair done and makeup and with like a business card. And I was like, I'm Dr. Heidi Levitt, da 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 da. Totally different than if I'm interviewing queer youth at a community center where come in wearing jeans and I'm wearing sneakers and I'm saying like, my name's Heidi, right? Thinking about like the different kind of ways that the power you bring in with you, just as someone who's educated, as someone, who's doing a research study, that there's a lot of power in doing a research study. It means you're creating narratives, you're creating information. How do you help people feel comfortable talking with you? In qualitative research, consent is a process. So this unfolds during the interview. People may tell you different things at the end of the interview than at the beginning. And you can let people know they can decline to answer a question. They can take a break. They can stop the interview, right? They can ask for clarification. So really thinking about this as a process where you're working with someone to help them feel comfortable sharing with you what they wish to share with you, right? Um, Super important. Is it okay? Often my students are interested in knowing, can I ask people to talk about painful experiences? And often our research is about painful experiences, right? Because we're wanting to help avoid those painful experiences, or we're wanting to deter them or to stop them from happening. And so you definitely can ask about painful experiences, and but you're going to want to make sure that you're asking about them within the scope of what was agreed to in your consent. And so you're not wanting to be voyeuristic, you're not wanting to be sensationalizing, but you're wanting to get information that will answer the questions that you have. You're also not wanting to be therapeutic. This is often a tricky thing for students in psychology, right? Because we learn a lot, we practice clinical skills or counseling skills, um, and then you may go into interview and you may have someone and you may think, gosh, I just learned this awesome intervention in my class last week. And like this person totally just said the thing that would set up me to do that intervention. And it could help them, right? And so sometimes people get pulled to be like therapists, and you haven't gotten consent to be a therapist, right? So you have to be really clear that you're there to do to be an interviewer. So you can interview about painful experiences, but you're going to not want to become therapeutic and you're going to not want to become voyeuristic. You're going to want to be professionally asking questions, which is what the person has agreed to do and given consent to do, which they can always revoke, right? If you think something's it's maybe very painful, it's good to have support resources available. I often have hotlines, crisis hotline information available to share with participants. And if you're not sure, you can check in. You can say, how are you feeling now in the interview? Right? Are you feeling okay? How are these questions? Does this feel like do they feel hard to answer? Are they okay? You can see and let your participant give you feedback, right? Um, Something else I always think about a lot as a critical constructivist researcher is, what can you give back to the participants? You want to make the problem better. So thinking about what are things that I could do that would make the problem better in some way. I'll ask you, actually, maybe write in the chat. What are things that you could do that could make a problem better after you do research? What are ways that research could make something feel better? What do you think? Let me see. No, I seem to have to go out to get my chat. Can folks think of anything? Why do we do research anyhow? If it's not going to help anyone feel better, or right? Why are we here? Why are we doing it? Right? So one thing is like educating, right? So I see that, Jocelyn, in the chat. Um, so we could be educating, we could have information that we provide for our participants, right? So like when I did the research in the South with religious leaders on domestic violence, I provided each of them with a list of domestic violence shelters and resources and things like that so that they could continue to share that information with people in their congregations who had domestic violence, right? I love that people are writing things in. Thank you. Awesome. Um, you can, so it could be that you educate your participants. I've also done it where I've had like different kinds of community meetings where I've had like all the religious leaders from the regional area come to have a meeting, and then we've talked about what the findings are from the study. So educating widely. I could be, let's see, using research for advocacy. Absolutely, right? Some of the research that we've done on LGBTQ issues have been used in court cases where people have been arguing to try to have rights for LGBTQ people, right? So absolutely, your research is can be an amazing tool for advocacy and super important in that way. Um, you could want to try to change a community. So we did work with the house family community um, in Memphis, with a focus on HIV, and we had a huge community outreach, right, through the parents in each of the house or families, right? And talking in their community about HIV, about what that looks like in their community, and making like a very big celebration, very positive, right? Um, engagement effort. Creating a resource guide. I love it. Holding non-judgmental spaces. So just, it's true, having just spaces where people can talk to each other, right? So saying, I'm going to now form like a support group in my community center or at my university, right? Um, awareness. So when you publish work, that increases awareness. People become more aware. You can present work at conferences, right? Um, make people aware of the issue that you think is important that they may not be noticing. Assessing interventions. Yeah. So are these interventions helpful? We're doing this. Is that a good thing? Is it a not good thing? Um, and so thinking about these kinds of things, right? Um, uh, a question here about how do we give enough support without therapizing. I think that we need to ask, you may need to ask your participants, right? And you may need to check with them, like, I think if you can ask them how they feel during the interview, if you feel like they feel uncomfortable, um, you could say, usually I end every interview by asking people, is there anything that I could do to make this interview better? And I want to know, right? If there's things that I could say that would make them feel more supported. Um, and so those are kinds of things that I keep in my mind, right? So these are all awesome ideas. Um, I'm going to go back to the slides here. Okay, so thinking about what you can give back. Uh, interview skills. So here, just thinking about interviewing skills. So here we're going to pretend that we have an interview where we're asking people about their experience of anxiety, right? And it could be anxiety around any issue that you're interested in that we're going to be imagining. So we want to think about, like, with whatever question we have, we're going to want to think about who do we want to recruit so that we could obtain rich data. So if I was interested in experiences of anxiety, right? Let's say, what would I be interested, what would be the kinds of people who I might want to try to interview? Who would I want to talk to? So you could think about this, right? What kind of variation of participants do I want? I don't want to talk to people who all have the exact same experience. I want to learn about people who have different kinds of experiences with anxiety, right? So I think about what would those look like, right? That fit in my question. What sub-questions would I ask, right? And I think carefully about how can I ask sub-questions again, right? Thinking about who we are, what our positionality is, how we want to really understand how that meeting was constructed for that person, not for me. How do I be very careful with having non-leading questions, right? And usually these go from more general to more specific, asking questions about the interview itself, like what I just said, I usually ask people at the end, so that my interview keeps improving all the time. Asking them if they had an experience before I start asking them what their experience was like, right? So that way I know, that they actually had this experience. So these are the kinds of these are kinds of things that I think about a lot. Um, if you wanted to ask about anxiety, yeah. So here there's trying to get the lived experience of the participant. Yeah. So asking that, it sounds phenomenological. It could be a phenomenological study, right? Um, Grounded theory and phenomenology have a lot of overlaps. I could talk about that more later too, if you'd like. They're both as a constructivist, very interested in the internal experience, phenomenology also internal experience. The critical piece brings a different lens to the grounded theory, but also important. Mm, and so, okay, ask me after about phenomenology, and I'm happy to talk more about it. But um, but but here, right? I thought it would be good to give an example of what this could look like. And so I know Kimberly was going to help me. Yes. And so I'll be the interviewer if that's okay. And can you be the participant?
Yes.
Awesome. So this is a poor interviewing example. So I want you all to be thinking about like what's happening here and especially noticing the things that I'm doing as the interviewer, right? And maybe how it could be a little bit better. So, Kimberly, tell me about your experience of anxiety.
Well, my head starts racing and my heart is beating fast. I just feel so out of control. I hate that feeling.
Hmm. When does this occur?
It happens mostly when I'm feeling out of control.
And what do you do to stop it?
I try to remind myself that it isn't helping and I should take some deep breaths and relax, but it doesn't always help.
What are other strategies that you use?
Well, I try to distract myself sometimes. I have exercises that my therapist gave me, but I rarely do them.
I see. And when did you begin feeling anxious?
Probably when I was about 10. I think it was around the time that I changed schools when my family moved to Maryland.
I see. And how does the anxiety affect your relationships? Oh,
That's the last
sorry.
one. I was like, do I make up an answer?
There you go.
Okay. I would say that it doesn't affect most of them so much. I think people just think this is a part of the way I am. Sometimes it helps that I worry about things because it means that other people don't have to. Like I remember having an argument because my cousin never remembers my kids' birthdays, but I always remember these. I have them all in my calendars with reminders and cues enough ahead so I can have presents ready. My cousin, though, is not as careful with this and she often forgets about my kids, which really hurts their feelings. And it upsets me too. She always was a spoiled kid. She just got pretty much everything she asked for from her parents without having to work for them. She had the most in fashion clothes and was really popular. In high school, she was a cheerleader and always in the crowd. I wasn't that way, and I always thought she should have been trying to include me more as my cousin. But she never really did thought about me then either, and I was never invited to these parties and wasn't included.
It sounds like that was really hurtful to you and like you were really jealous of her.
Well, I don't know that I wanted to be popular so much, but I wanted her to think about me and to include me in her group of friends. I remember another time when we all went out together in a large group. We were in a club and I went to the bathroom, and when I came out, they had all left. They apologized after and said that they just thought I was with them when they first left, but I was really hurt.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about how your anxiety affects your relationship with your family?
I think mostly they weren't so affected. It's hard for them to tell that is going on in my mind and all that I am worrying about each day. I mean, they see some of it, but it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kimberly.
You're like
You're
an
you
actress.
were great. Especially when you didn't have you were like, now what do I do? So that was awesome. Thank you. I want participants to think about what are the things that you're seeing that the interviewer is doing here that maybe aren't as helpful, and maybe hold those things or make a little note for yourself about what those things look like, right? Um, and then I'm going to show you a better example if Kimberly will risk doing this again with me, and then uh, and then we'll compare them, right? And we'll see how they are different. So tell me about your experience of anxiety.
Well, my head starts racing and my heart is beating fast. I just feel so out of control and I hate that feeling.
Can you tell me more about that out of control feeling? Out of control of what?
I guess out of control of my future. Like it feels like everything is going to become bad and spiral in some downward way, and I won't be able to do anything to stop it.
I see. Like you can't stop it.
Yes, it feels like I'm paralyzed.
Why do you think it feels like that?
Well, sometimes there isn't anything I could do about a situation, and I think it is a bad situation, and I'm scared about how much worse it will be.
Uh-huh. Could you um give me an example?
Okay, I found out that my daughter is being pushed into a basic science class. This made me so upset. She has been working really hard to keep up with her classmates. I can just imagine what this will do to her self-esteem. I can't imagine that she will feel worse about herself, and that makes it so much harder for her to try. Some kids like challenge, but she sort of beats herself up and convinces herself that she can't do things when she hits an obstacle. I can envision this generalizing to other things and her feeling like she can't do anything. And I panic because I feel like I can't stop them from putting her in that class. It's not up to me. And I don't know how I can make her feel differently about herself and her potential for learning. I'm afraid also that socially she'll feel ostracized from her friends and will feel lonely.
Hmm. And what happens to you when you think about this fear?
I just feel so out of control and like I can just see her whole future disappear. Part of me knows it's just a science class and she doesn't even want to go into sciences, but part of me feels like it's her whole future. I don't want her to feel less than other kids, and I feel like it's my job to protect her as a parent and I'm failing her. Like I'm a failure and I have no worth if I can't keep her from having a horrible high school experience. I feel so overwhelmed and powerless. I want to throw myself at the teachers and beg them for help.
Hmm. It sounds like you feel when you're anxious, you're you're doubting your own worth and thinking that you can't protect others. that you're failing irrevocably?
Yes. I think this is why I'm so anxious a lot of the time. A lot of the time, it feels like I'm failing and I'm a failure. When I think I might not do well at something, or that people will not like what I'm doing, or will judge what my kids are doing, I just get caught in a loop of worrying that I can't escape and can't change how the system will view her.
It's hard to stop it. Even if a part of you knows that some things are not up to you, there are bigger systems. What does it feel like to have your family be caught in this system?
Well, I worry about advocating too little, but also too much. In my culture, we are always read as being pushy, and I worry that the teachers will take it out on her if I ask for too much.
Huh. Can you tell me more about this cultural aspect and how it influences your anxiety in this context, or maybe in others also, if it's relevant there? Okay, so we're going to stop here. Thank you again, Kimberly. That was awesome. Um, so if we look at these two examples, um, what do we notice? What are some differences that we notice in the examples? I'm gonna go out so that I can see the text. Okay. So she could have stayed with what the interviewer was sharing. So you're right. The interviewer kept going from question to question to question to question to question. So there was a lot of questions asked, but there wasn't a lot of depth of understanding of any of the answers, right? Um, it was jumping around a lot. Yeah, the interviewer was not really listening. So we don't hear a lot of the interviewer reflecting what the participant was saying, really listening to what's going on. We don't see them probing into like, what does this mean? The interview is asking different questions. Yeah, in the first one, a lot, and the second one was curiosity and compassion. I love those words, right? So this interviewer is really listening to what is happening and asking questions deliberately to help understand better. And also there's a caring feeling, right? Like when you're really listening to someone and reflecting what's happening inside of them, often people feel cared for, which helps them feel more comfortable sharing things with you, right? Because it's hard to share something with someone who's kind of like half listening to you and half looking for what their next question is. And you kind of got that feeling, right? Jocelyn says the interviewer was allowed the interviewee to go on tangents, right? So we could see that there was different places where um, uh, here in the interview, in the poor interview, there's a whole thing about the cousin, right? And birthday presents, and that have nothing to do with how this person feels anxiety, right? So they let them go way off. And then there's this sort of statement here that sometimes people feel, didn't directly come from her, right? It was sort of the interviewer was putting that on to the participant, and instead of asking what did that feel like for you, how did you feel, and getting it from the participant, the interviewer is putting on what she thinks is the internal experience, right? So this is not such a great style of interview either, right? And you can see that here, in the poor interview, there's tell me about your experience of anxiety, and then almost every other thing is a new question that the person's asking. Whereas in the strong one, it starts off, tell me about your experience of anxiety, and the whole 2 pages is exploring that experience of anxiety, right? The whole 2 pages is exploring, what does this feel like? What is your fear? And we're getting a way deeper understanding of like what that feels like, right? It feels like I'm out of control. It feels like um, the future is disappearing. It feels like I'm failing. It feels like I'm helpless, right? So there's all of these different understandings that come forward that we're missing in the first one because the person was just jumping around so quickly. So, and so we notice, right, like a difficulty keeping focus. It seemed like in the poor interview, they were adding interpretations, jumping around. It's if you don't really fully understand the answers in the interview, you're not going to understand them after the interview. You'll be like, what was it that person meant when they said this? And you'll be like, I don't know. This is your chance to really understand something. So in the closer one, in the better what interview, there was like staying closer to the responses, a depth of understanding. When the participant did go off track a little bit, the interviewer said, "What is this like for you?" Right? Bringing it back to the participant's feelings, not letting them continue to go off. Listening and also asking about both internal and cultural influences. So this is really typical of critical constructivist grounded theory, that you're wanting to get a sense of what does something feel like inside, and also how does it play out culturally? How does it play out in systems, right? So here the participant talking about school systems and helplessness and judgment, um, and uh, and classroom dynamics, right? So all these things. So I'm going to shift here and move over then to talking a little bit about the analysis. Just to say, in case it's not already obvious, like I can't see the chat while I'm talking. So so if you have questions, I know that Kimberly and Jocelyn are keeping track of them, and then I can answer some of them after, or if there's something really pressing, they're, welcome to interrupt me. But awesome. And so thinking about analysis, right? So I want to talk a little bit about like what are the central kinds of steps in a grounded theory analysis. And these are similar to most kinds of grounded theory analysis, although the language I'm using is drawing from the CCGT method. But um, in most and in pretty much all grounded theory analyses, the way you begin is by looking at the text. So you have interviews or you have pieces of text that you've collected that have to do with your question. And you're really interested in looking in the text for answers to your question. So, so usually your interviews or your text, you would divide them up into initial units of text, and each unit would have sort of like one answer that responds to your question. If the person is not answering your question, like if they're talking about the birthday party and like the calendar that their cousin uses and stuff like that, or the calendar that they use, and they're just like off on a tangent, you can just not even unitize that because it's not answering your question, right? So you're really thinking about what is my question? And creating units for those questions. And then you label each unit. So you want to create a meaningful, evocative, reflective label for each of those answers to your question, right? Each of those units. And a unit could be half a page, or it could be a quarter of a page. It could be 2 lines. It could be 2 pages. So they could be different lengths of time, lengths of space or time. But they're all focused on giving like one answer, and you're going to try to label that answer with usually a label that's like a line and a half of text, something like that. Sometimes 2 lines of text, but you're giving it a label which will make that meaning very crystallized. And then you can start working with looking at the labels, which also shortens the amount of text that you're looking at. So then you're looking at a couple of labels per page instead of a whole page of text, right? It's a lot easier. And the way this approach works is you use constant comparison, which is a process in which all the units are compared to each other, and you look for commonalities in that are also answering your question, right? And every time when you find one, you create an initial category. So here you can see the subcategories at the bottom of this hierarchy. These subcategories shouldn't replicate your question. This is probably the biggest problem that people have when they're doing qualitative research. Is they want to do I was just looking at a study like this earlier today, wanting to do an analysis on what are experiences of relational ruptures. And then you have a category that's called experiences of relational ruptures, right? That category doesn't tell you anything. It just tells you what your question is. You always want your category to be answering your question. So to be saying, what is the experience, right? Say what it is, right? So don't replicate your question. I'll talk more about that again after. Creating a hierarchy of categories. So after you develop initial categories, you begin to look within them and you begin to and you give each of them a label in the similar way that you did to the meeting units. And as you look at commonalities and patterns within them, you group them together and you create a higher order category that reflects like what are the things that are in common across these subcategories. So I might have different experiences of ruptures that have to do with anger, right? Anger at my therapist, let's say. And then I might have some that have to do with shame that's directed towards myself, that's making me withdraw from my therapist, right? I might have different kinds of categories and patterns that I could see that I group together, and I can create higher order categories that reflect those different patterns, right? So I might have one focused on shame and one focused on anger, one focused on something else, and etc. And then these you again take and you look for commonalities within them and you create a higher order cluster that sort of reflects those commonalities. And you keep doing this until you end up with only one core category. So usually in grounded theory, you end up with one core category that's sort of like the central meaning, right? The meaning that's sort of underlying a lot of the other meanings that you've identified in your categories, in your hierarchy. And so you don't always have to have a core category, but it's what's usually expected when you're doing a grounded theory analysis. You could have reasons why you don't want to have one. For my dissertation, I was focused on silences in therapy. And my main finding was that people had been grouping silences all together and just counting up the numbers of seconds of silence in sessions, and then correlating those to different things. And my main finding was that there is no one meaning of silence, that there are specifically different meanings of silence. And so I said, I don't want to have a core category because there's no core. And so I didn't have one. So you don't have to have it, but typically you do. There are two awesome innovations that came with grounded theory into the field, and both of them are now being used across many different qualitative methods, even outside of grounded theory. One is theoretical sampling. And so usually grounded theory is done in waves. And so I might have an analysis of like 8 people's interviews, and then I develop a hierarchy like this, and I would look at it and think about like, are there things that are missing in this hierarchy? Are there things that I don't fully understand, that I need to learn more about? Are there perspectives that are missing, right? As an example, we were doing research in the early 2000s with the anti-LGBTQ marriage amendments, and we did a study on people's experiences of these marriage amendments. And we had in that study one person initially only who was a parent. And their interview was so different than everyone else's interview because they talked about their kids and the impact on their family and told really different things than any other interview. And we were like, whoa, we did the theoretical sampling and we are like, we need to get more parents. We need to look more at this. There's something here that we don't fully understand. And so in our next wave of recruiting, we recruited for parents, right? And tried to see if we could get more of a sense of how does that anti-marriage amendments impact families. And so this is an awesome thing, theoretical sampling, because it lets you think about positionality. So like if you're interviewing, if you're doing something, a study on like being Black in psychology, you might want to think about like what are the kinds of differences that are going to matter, right? Is it going to be different if you're Black in psychology in counseling psychology or in experimental psychology? Or is it going to be different if you're Black in psychology in the North or in the South? Or is it going to be different if you're Black in psychology in labs that are focused on racial justice? And so thinking about like um, making sure that you're sampling people who are bringing a lot of different perspectives, right? And about your findings, your questions is really important. So that's theoretical sampling, right? It usually leads to having a much richer, more interesting hierarchy and findings, really. Saturation is knowing when do you stop collecting data. So this was a really cool thing because there wasn't really a lot of guidance on that when you're doing interview studies. And here what they found was that as people are doing qualitative studies and interviewing people, they find that there becomes more redundancy in the answers. So if I, so let me just see here. Okay. So if I am interviewing Sana and I ask Sana, tell me about your experience of being Black in psychology, and I hear Sana's experience, every single thing that Sana says is going to be new because I have no data. So every single thing is like a new unit, is a new category, is a new idea. But then I go and I talk to Mariana and I say the same questions about being Black in psychology. And now some of the things that Mariana says are very different from what Sana says, but some of them are going to be similar, right? And so I'll get still a lot of new units, a lot of new categories. Um, but then I go and I talk to Viviana, and Viviana says some things that are similar to Sana, and some things that are similar to Mariana, and some different things. And then I talk to Carla, and I get some new things, but more things that are the same. And what starts to happen is after I've interviewed a whole bunch of you, right? And then I get to Ray, most of the things Ray's saying, right, who's towards the end of my, at least of my screen, a lot of the things have been said by someone before. There's less new things, there's less new insights. And it may be that after I interview Magna and Vishaka, then that their two interviews don't really add new categories. They don't really add new things. They're supporting and reinforcing ideas that people have said, which is important, but they're not adding new things. And this tells me that I probably can stop interviewing, right? Because if I just keep interviewing, I could interview another 100 people, but if almost everything they said has already been said, I'm not getting new insights. So it's not so useful for me, right? To be doing this. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat right now. Someone said, I love the framework that's being suggested. This was when you were talking about number one. It helps with the system to the processes that I feel like I've been doing, although used to frame it more as thematic analysis. I wonder, aside from the difference between CCGT, TA, phenomenology, and narrative analysis, as we begin coding and creating units and hierarchies of categories, how do we ensure we do not end up decontextualizing the model, especially given, for example, page limitations, where we may need to pick and choose short excerpts to, for example, elaborate each unit, categories, or clusters?
Awesome. So it's a really good question, right? Um, so I feel like there's a bunch of questions inside of it. So, but in terms of not decontextualizing the units, so it's something that we think about from the very beginning when we're creating our initial meaning units, right? Our initial way of unitizing and breaking up our interviews or text is our labels for that text tend to be like a line or two of text, the labels. They're not, we don't in CCGT usually have like one word labels or two word labels. And this is part of the reason why, is that it's really important for us to have the context for what's happening and what's being said. That could be the relational context, the cultural context, it could be systemic context or interpersonal dynamics. But but from the very beginning, we're coding for that, right? And so that way, as you begin comparing the units to create the categories, you're thinking about even from the initial categories, you have the context there. And so you're bringing it up. Our category titles tend to be a little bit longer because we are focused on context. And so in terms of the issue around page limits, I've written a lot about page limits. And so if you look, like we have, I shared the American Psychological Association um, standard journal article reporting standards for qualitative research. And so in there, we argue that qualitative research needs to have longer pages, that you need that on average that you should be allotting more pages for this kind of research. And so you could use that to argue for more pages when you're submitting your research to journals. I usually, when I submit my research, I usually have a cover letter where I talk about how I'm using a qualitative method, how qualitative methods require having examples from texts and quotes and things like, and more description of methods that make manuscripts longer. And I ask for often extensions in terms of my page limits. So often I argue for those things. I think that it's becoming more familiar to people in psychology that the idea that qualitative research needs often to be longer. But you may decide that you want to publish in a journal that doesn't have extended page limits, and you may have to decide, to pick shorter excerpts or fewer. Often I go with fewer excerpts to exemplify your findings, but still have it be long enough to show the context. So instead of having like three short quotes, I might have one longer quote that has more context in it and is more meaningful in that way. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I'll go back, and then if you have other questions, then yeah, feel free to. Oh, awesome. Feel free to ask. And so yeah, so this is sort of like the basic idea in terms of okay, in terms of the way grounded theory tends to work generally, right? Creating sometimes they don't call it meaning units, and they might have different labels for these processes, but generally to make it very simple, we like to make it very simple. Creating units that really reflect the experience in context, that are answering your question, creating subcategories that group together meanings. Groupings together doesn't have to mean that it's only identifying commonalities. It could be also identifying differences. Like it's different. This is different for this set of people than this set of people, right? Or in this context than in that context. Um, and then, okay. And so then talking a little bit about analysis in terms of critical and constructivist ideas, right? So in the data analysis as a constructivist, again, I'm really interested in thinking about and picking up in my data how change happens across time and place and context. I'm interested in um, often in understanding how meaning is made, how changes happen, how changes in meaning happen. I think about the multiple social spheres that my phenomenon occurs within, right? And I might think about the um, different ways that these might intersect. So you might have, so like just going back to the Black and Psych example, there might be experiences that people have in their families about what it means to be in psychology. And there might be different experiences or being back in psychology, different experiences in a classroom, different experiences in the job market, different experiences in um, like flipping it to being a teacher in the classroom. So there could be many different kinds of experiences that all intersect with each other. They don't stand alone, right? And so these are things that we are often very interested in. Like how do meanings carry across social spheres? How do they influence each other? Sometimes a meaning in one social sphere leads there to be pushback in another social sphere, right? So we'll talk like you may see an example. We can talk about that with the analysis example that we're going to look at in a second. Considering how meanings, acts, and symbols, right, are acting. So often when we're looking at meanings, often there's ways that we symbolize those meanings, right? So we might have different, like in my research on LGBTQ stuff, there's lots of symbols of different LGBTQ identities that people have, that they wear. And they may use those symbols to communicate different things to each other. They may hide those symbols if it's unsafe and they don't want to be seen in a certain way. Um, but there's different ways of acting or meanings that could be really important and that could help understand how something works in the world, right? Because when we have these sorts of, often we have identities or um, we have different sorts of social positions that we're in. There are things that are in us, but they're also functioning within systems, right? And so we want to look at those sorts of things. And so these are all things we think about as we're engaging in that analysis, right? So, so we're trying to bring complexity into our analysis. From a critical perspective, we could be using critical theories to enhance our ability to see patterns. And so this is often confusing. This is often a little bit confusing for people, and reviewers may ask questions about this. Like sometimes people think, well, if I have a theory, if I say, oh, I'm starting off with like critical race theory, I'm starting off with a feminist theory, I'm starting off with like a critical queer theory, aren't I biased? And then if I'm biased, then how can I do my analysis? Right. So there's this kind of question that people get when they're doing critical research often. Right. And especially, and this is, I think, especially common for qualitative research, because there's this idea that you shouldn't be biased. Right. And usually what we say to that is that the word bias isn't really a good fit because you always have a perspective that you're taking. So instead of thinking about having or not having bias, the question is, what is your perspective and being aware of it, right? And having different perspectives can help you or hurt you, right? It can hurt you. And where it's damaging is when having a perspective stops you from seeing something. And so this is why we talked before about how people do memoing and they do reflection and they think about who they are and they think about how their perceptions might, influence or um, keep their participants from sharing things with them. Uh, and they think about how to address those things, right? But theories also can help you see things that you couldn't see otherwise, right? So you could bring a critical race theory that lets you see different kinds of racial dynamics that are happening in society. And then you can see when you see those things, you'll be able to identify them more easily. You'll be able to talk about them more easily, right? Because you can point to them in that text and you can say, look, this is a sign, this is tied to racism, this is tied to this dynamic that we know happens in workplaces and da 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 da. And so, uh, so as a critical analyst, right, I'm wanting to use my critical theories to help me see better, right? And I'm going to be upfront about it. I'm going to say these are the lenses that I brought or theories that I brought, and I'm going to make clear that these are things that are helping me, right? And if I get pushback, then I'm going to push back, right? And that's good, right? You can push back and say, no, these are things that are useful. Everyone has perspectives, but these are perspectives that are helpful. Considerations when working. Yeah, I took a moment to talk about that because I think it's something that it's not uncommon to encounter. Considerations when working with research teams and participatory methods. So trying to think about as I'm doing data analysis, are there people who will see things in the data that I might miss, right? So like if I like doing research on African American house family systems, there's a lot of things that I would miss because I don't have the experience of being in those systems. And so it was really important for me to have co-researchers who have been in those family systems and who understand the meanings of the different dynamics that were being talked about, and to be consulting with them, right? And to be consulting also with people in the community. We consulted a lot with community leaders and family leaders and people to be sure that our analysis was correct. We also check back with people who are participants and we ask them, does this seem like this finding is right to you? Do you think that it could be improved, right? And so we get this information before our final findings, so we can really be sure that we're integrating understandings from different perspectives, right? Developing categories that shed light on variation. So I'm trying to think about, as I'm developing categories, I'm really thinking also about what is going to be useful, right? What findings have not been said a million times, right? So I do psychotherapy research and so I cannot tell you, and I'm an editor, so for a journal, so I can't tell you how many papers I've read where the finding is the relationship in psychotherapy is important. It's like, okay, it's important. Yeah. But like a gazillion people have said that before, right? So like, how is this helping me? And so really thinking about what's going to be most useful, right? We're critical researchers. We want to be able to push ahead. We want to challenge systems. We want to create transformation. We want to raise consciousness. So what are the findings that are going to do that, right? Those are the findings I want to be creating. So I'm thinking about in my analysis, if I find myself creating categories that are like, oh, boring, I think, okay, this is not good. I need to figure out how am I going to look at the data to pull forward the data that's going to be the most interesting and create the most potential for change. Okay. So I thought I would invite us to do this little analysis. exercise. So this is based on a study on gender for gay men who do drag, right? So it's gay men doing drag. Um, Kimberly, do you want to go again with me and do this, or I don't know?
Yeah, it's entirely fine.
Okay. All right. So, so you'll be a gay man who does drag. Can you help me understand how you experience your gender?
Well, most of my time, I feel like I am a male. Huh. Friend one, what?
Or is it supposed to be like your friend's name? It's just supposed to be,
Oh,
it's just
okay.
edited out.
Amy always tells me how surprisingly masculine I can seem, especially when we are playing football. But sometimes I'm very feminine and I feel like a shift inside myself.
And then there's a pause, and then it's your partner's name.
Jacob thinks that this seems to come out more when I'm feeling playful. It seems like a way to express fun more.
Can you tell me, what about the connection between fun and femininity? What is that for you?
There is a freedom that comes from being feminine for me. I feel like I have been told all my life that it's taboo, that there is something wrong with being who I am, kind of a shorter and more soft kind of man. Here, the things that are problematic about being a man becomes fabulous. It is exciting.
Awesome. How do you see femininity and drag gender differently? Or do you?
Well, Well, it has changed over time for me, but I think femininity is more being passive and it has got more to do with being proper and controlled. It has to do with having less power. Doing drag is being out there in your face. It is taking up space and being noticed.
What is it like to be noticed in this way?
Usually it is great, sometimes not. When I was at the club, there was some straight men who were leering at me. I didn't like this at all, and I was upset because they were making comments about and being jerks. This happens sometimes. I usually can find a catty remark just to make them shut up, but I had just had a fight with my boyfriend, and I guess I was feeling really sensitive at that moment, and I wanted to leave the stage because they were not only calling me names, but really harassing another one of the girls.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So here, what I want you to notice is, um, and maybe write in the text, what are the things, yeah, let's just take a moment and write in the text. What are the things that you learn about this participant's experience of gender? How does this person experience masculinity, femininity, experience drag gender? Let's just take a moment and maybe think about what are the things that you're seeing inside of what's being said here, right? Because there's some details, right? Like playing football and being short and soft. And we're really wanting to focus on what does this tell us about their experience of gender, right? Um, and so looking at these texts and maybe making some notes and you can put them in the chat would be awesome. Um, and thinking about like how is this different? What are we learning about what gender is from this interview? Let's see. So, that they're fluid, right? And flexible in different contexts, that they're normalized slash okay in certain spaces. So this is a very insightful comment, right? That that gender could be experienced very differently depending on context, right? Like what gender feels like in one space could be very different than in another space. And even depending on like your emotional state, right? Like having a fight with your boyfriend might make you feel more sensitive. more hesitant to be gendered or to be displaying your gender in a certain kind of way. So that could be a thing that you could see. I don't know if there's any other messages or things that people see here. There's things I think about the idea of femininity being passive and drag being like powerful, right? So, which I think is really interesting, right? So the idea that for this person, right, femininity felt like it was something that was denied to him, that he couldn't access. But then there's something about drag that seems to have more power. And so the way we think about like power tied up with gender could be reshaped, right? Here it is being reshaped. The participant is saying, when I do gender in this context, I'm able to have a lot more power, right? And to do femininity in a powerful way, right? So that's a different kind of thing. So when we're thinking about this, about this data, we're thinking about like um, what is the uh, um, I'm just switching back. What is the um, information that we're given, but also like what does this tell us about the systems that the person's in, the relationships that the person's in, right? There's something dangerous about doing gender, right? There's something dangerous about gender because here it's tied to this leering, right? If you do gender, you may be objectified. You may be treated in a way that you don't want, right? And here, like this idea of like protecting, like that there needs to be protection against it and what that looks like. And what that takes emotionally to do that protection. So these are all different kinds of findings. Like this is a very short, it's a really short piece of text, but we can see like a lot of different findings that could evolve, especially as we look at this text in connection to the rest of the interview and other people's interviews, right? We could see, are other people going to say similar things? Are other people going to say that drag gender is a way of doing gender that has power compared to the other options, right? Which is to be told you can't do your gender or gender is more seen as more passive, right? So there's different kinds of options. So as we're thinking about that, we're coding for the initial units and we're looking at the creating categories and higher order categories and patterns to try to capture not just what they're saying, but these other kinds of things too. So these higher order things too. And so here, often these emerge in the higher order categories, these more like cutting across larger kinds of theoretical meanings. And what we're wanting to do is to, again, avoid things that are obvious, right? We don't want to be saying the alliance is important, the relationship is important. We want to say something that is going to be insightful, right? That's going to bring something more useful, typically. Sometimes if there's some question about, so thinking about, how do I say something in a way that's going to make a change that's going to be impactful? Uh, Looking for findings that will advance your field, so not just replicate things that have been established. Thinking about patterns of difference. Often patterns of difference are more exciting than just noting commonalities, because if it's something that everyone experiences, then it's more likely that it's well known, right? Whereas being able to identify like what is the difference and why is there this difference can be really helpful, right? So in my work, I've done a lot of my writing is more looking at different LGBTQ gender communities. And so looking at like, why is it that gender looks different in drag communities than it does in non-binary communities or in butch communities or in different kinds of bear communities, whatnot, right? Category titles may vary in length. So again, like we often tend to have longer category titles in CCGT because we're focused on that context as being so important from the beginning up. And developing findings that can lead to clear guidance. So often thinking about like if my findings are about policy or about what to do as a therapist or about what to do as a educator, I want to try to think about like how can I make findings that will speak to what to do in that context, right? So these are things I have in my mind. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about methodological integrity and then I'll take questions after. So, methodological integrity. So this is a concept that was developed by a task force of the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology. This is a section of Division 5 in APA, which is the division on methods. And there was a lot of issues in the field because what was happening in reviewing was that people were reviewing qualitative research and they were basically using checklists. Some journals actually had checklists that they were using, and they would say like, did you do these procedures? Then it's thematic analysis. Did you do these things? Then it's grounded theory. Did you do these things? Then it's phenomenology. And there wasn't a lot of thinking about how methods should be used flexibly and how methods should be tailored for your question, for your participants, right? For your purposes, right? And so the main idea in this, what became this paper, was that research should be conducted in a way that's coherent with the researcher's questions, right? With their epistemologies, with what they think is important to know, right? So that could have to do with being constructivist, being critical, could have many different kinds of being psychoanalytic, whatever it is that the researcher is wanting to know. And the study characteristics, right? So thinking about who are the participants, right? So if I'm developing a study, for instance, for people who are transient or who don't have homes that they live in a permanent way, then I'm not going to want to require that people give me feedback on findings, right? Because that means that I have to be able to do an analysis, which may take a year, and then find all the participants again to give me feedback on the findings, but they're not going to be in the same places, right? An example, I think I had this also with the student population, right? Where students at a university were interviewed, but then they all graduated, right? I was interviewing seniors, they're all gone, right? The next year, you can't find them again. And so thinking about like, if we have different, and so some journals were requiring things like you need to have participant feedback, but that wasn't possible for some questions, and especially for questions for people who are of lower socioeconomic positions and don't have stability in their lives, right? So it meant that research wasn't getting published because the journals weren't accepting it. And so what we're arguing here is that you need to think about like, what are your aims? If your aims are, I want to produce research on this very at-risk population, and this is important, then I need to change my methods to make that possible. And I need to be flexible in terms of the way I do my research. And so that's the main idea in this kind of paper. So usually I point to this paper because I've had people come to me and say like, oh, this paper like helped me publish so much research. Because when I got challenged and said like, oh, you changed the steps that are usually used in this method or that method, right? Even outside of CCGT, right? This is a paper that's not just this concept is folded into CCGT, but this paper is addressing all qualitative methods. When I changed methods to make my study stronger, my reviewers didn't like it, and I could use this paper to argue against that, right? And that's exactly what this paper was for. It was meant for the people to use it to argue against when reviewers didn't like what they did that actually made their study more appropriate for their participants or questions. And there's two main concepts here. One being fidelity, which is the idea that you should try to think about what actually is most important for your participants, for your question, and that this is going to look different. So for instance, like if I'm thinking about what is adequate data, I'm going to ask different questions if I'm doing a psychotherapy study than a sexuality study, right? If I do a psychotherapy study, I'm going to ask people about I'm going to want to have a lot of different therapy orientations. I'm going to want to know what people's philosophies. If I'm doing a sexuality study, I'm not going to care about their therapeutic orientations at all, right? It won't matter, right? But I'm going to care a lot about their sexual identities. I may be very interested in how they understand their genders or how they experience. I may have very different questions, and what makes my participant group strong will be very different and very tailored to those very different topics. In terms of utility, like thinking about how to make your findings very useful. So one of the main things here that happens is sometimes people will publish findings that almost are contradictory, right? So they might have this is the same problem of publishing your question and not your finding. But people will have a category that's something like why femme identity is good, and then another category, why femme identity is bad, right? And that doesn't tell me anything about either femme identity or about if I should think it's good or bad, right? Because it has both, and it's not telling me. And so instead, what you want to really do is bring together things that have difference so that I could say, when is femme identity good? When is femme identity bad? What are the things about the context, about the social group, about the system that makes this good or bad, right? So these are things that I think about and would be helpful. This is just a picture of the chart for methodological integrity. I won't go through it all here because I want to leave time for questions and conversation. So just to say that this kind of concept is very much at the heart of critical constructivist grounded theory. We're very much thinking about how to walk researchers through the process. Like, so in that book, for instance, it's in a series of APA books on qualitative methods that I think all are really awesome books. So they're useful to check out and they're pretty inexpensive. But the idea here is to really walk people through thinking about, like, what is my question and how do I make decisions about my method that will really support me getting good answers to my specific question with my specific participants, and to really think about the rationale of their study so that it's coherent, right? So that you have something strong and at the end. And this thoughtfulness at the beginning really helps you to be able to present and defend your choices later on. You can advocate for your qualitative methods because you know why you chose them and why they were helpful. And then you can always decide. Grounded theory, I think the nicest thing to me about grounded theory and CCGT is the hierarchy of categories that is often pretty comprehensive compared to a lot of qualitative methods and can lead to many different kinds of options in terms of what you want to do as a follow-up project. So again, I talked about how I've used these to develop items for measures, to develop treatment plans, to develop educational plans, to develop um, ideas about policy. So there could be many different ways you can, many different things that you could do with this that you may not even be thinking about at the start. But because it maps out the findings with a lot of comprehension and detail, you have got a lot of flexibility after. Um, so I think it's fun and exciting, and I think it's best when you really make it your own. So I'm going to stop there. And then, yeah, I was hoping for about 15 minutes or so of questions, and we're pretty close to that. Um, so thoughts or questions? I'm not sure.
There's a question in the chat by SY. I'm not sure if it got addressed or not.
Okay. Um, Something I was also wondering about, especially given the current sociopolitical climate, are regarding positionality statements. While critical reflexivity are so important in qualitative research, I've always felt a bit uncomfortable since many of the work I do involves citizen science works. Marginalized community members are co-developing research with me to state them, maybe outing them, which may be more harmful than helpful. I myself possess marginalized identities and can make it difficult to write these statements. How do you suggest mm, that we integrate reflexivity as an internal or discuss the process while keeping it safe? I think this is a really, really good question. It's a good question now. I think it's always been a really good question. I think that there's been a movement in psychology. I know because we've done meta-analyses looking at these, or meta-method studies looking at these um, reflexivity statements where it's really become very status quo now to include reflexivity statements in qualitative studies. Like it's expected that you do that now. It didn't used to be, right, when I started publishing, but now it's pretty expected to do that. You shouldn't have to disclose things that you don't feel comfortable disclosing. The important thing is to talk about the process that you used. So it's not as important for you to reveal all your identities or all of anyone else's identities as it is to say that you thought about your identities and that you talked about your identities and that you thought about how your identities might influence your data collection, the questions you ask, your analysis, and what you did about it. So you don't have to say what your identities are, but saying that you went through a process like that is what's really important. If reviewers, I just recently wrote an editorial in Qualitative Psychology specifically addressing this point because I was seeing people saying things like people should never do research that's not on their own identity. And I felt concerned about that because and that also is implying that you need to say that you have that identity or you shouldn't be doing that research, right? And people may not, as an LGBTQ researcher, um, that does a lot of international, that's done that, and my partner, especially Sharon Horn, they've done a lot of international consultation before, before this political moment that we're in, with people who couldn't possibly be out because it was illegal in the countries that they were in, right? And so thinking about uh, like that there's many reasons why you shouldn't have to have all the identities of the participants that you're studying. It's almost impossible often to have all the identities of your participants, even if you have. So if I'm interested in um, doing something on uh, queer people in the, or let's say lesbians in uh, in education, right? So I might be a lesbian in education, but my participants are all going to be different than me still, right? Even though I'm a lesbian in education. They're going to be in different kinds of education. There's going to be in different kinds of classrooms. They're going to be different ages than I am. They're going to have different experiences in terms of regions of the country than I am. So to think that I have to have all of the experiences myself, that all of them, it's just not a feasible thing. Plus, I would much rather see like more people do social justice research, right? Than to say, let's constrain it and make it so that few people can do that work. And also it puts the burden on the group that's struggling with the kind of oppression that they have to produce all the research only themselves seems problematic to me. So in any case, I have an editorial where I talk a lot about I think I have, I don't know how many different reasons, like 9 different reasons why people shouldn't have to disclose information that they don't want to. It's unsafe. It's not required. It's not helpful. Um, and why they don't need to have all of the identities or experiences of their participants. But what they do need to do is they need to be mindful of the experiences they have and the experiences they don't have. And they need to think about how are they going to address both of those things, right? Because experiences you have, it could mean that you're coming to, I could say, well, I'm a lesbian education, so I think I understand what this is. And then I'm not really listening to my participants. So I need to be able to deal with that. Experiences I don't have, and so I may be not noticing different things that I should be noticing, and so I need to deal with that. Either case, you need to deal with your positionality. I don't know. I hope I hope that wasn't too long of a rant, and that was also helpful. Awesome. SYC asks awesome questions. Yeah, I love them. Yeah. It was like I think it was like a couple of issues ago. But I've written the last few editorials are all about reflexivity and managing reflexivity. Um, any other questions or anything else you want to ask about? I know there was some questions earlier about grounded theory and phenomenology. Um, So, a main difference between grounded theory, so phenomenology, I guess first off, there's also a whole bunch of different kinds of phenomenology. A lot of methods now in psychology, there's different versions of those methods. And so it's not just thinking about the method, but thinking about like the epistemological position or like the purpose, the aims of that method that would fit for you, right? Um, so, so yeah, I was really happy to talk about CCGT with you all because if for those people who are interested in doing race studies related work, the critical part is just so important, right? But the but but phenomenology generally is focused very much on the interiority, on the interior experience of something. Um, so CCGT is a little bit different from it because of the critical part, which is more focused on also noticing how that internal experience extends out into the world, how it plays out, how it functions, how it's constructed systemically, how it involves societal kinds of oppression and privilege, etc. The other thing is that phenomenal is that grounded theory develops usually a very comprehensive hierarchy, and phenomenology doesn't usually have the same emphasis on as comprehensive a hierarchy. And I think that that's similar with a lot of qualitative methods. I think grounded theory is having very strong emphasis on a very systematic hierarchy compared to most methods, most other qualitative methods, which I really love, again, because I've started studies before and not thought, oh, now I want to use this to develop items for a measure that I wanted to develop. Like that comes to me like a year after I thought of the study idea. But then I have this awesome hierarchy with all these detailed categories that I could use to develop all these items, right? Whereas a lot of measures might have like, 6 categories or I don't know, 10 categories or they often have a shorter number of a smaller hierarchy. Um, in that grounded theory one I had like 49 or something like that. So I had a lot of items that I now could use. It was awesome. Um, any other questions besides phenomenology?
There was one question, um, expanding what Erica was asking earlier, where they were wondering to what extent phenomenological and narrative approaches can overlap with CCGT approaches and how we can build the approaches.
Yeah, I think that they can overlap. I think you can take like a narrative or a phenomenological like interest into CCGT. I think that the main difference, I think narrative also is one where there's many different kinds of narrative analysis, but often narrative analysis is more focused on like looking within a person's experience and not as much across people's experiences. Whereas CCGT, typically, grounded theory in general, typically is interested in looking at how patterns appear across. So that can be a difference. But, to understand how patterns appear across, you need to be able to understand what each participant is saying to you. And so there needs to be an understanding of that. So it could be that you could use a multi-method study where you could do a narrative analysis where you create narratives of each participant, and then you create a grounded theory analysis looking across them to identify like um, patterns in terms of their social context, etc. That could be cool. Okay. Well, if there aren't other questions, then I'm really enjoyed talking with all of you and really hope that you enjoy using qualitative methods, whatever you decide to do.
Thank you so much for speaking today.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. We have some other summer sessions coming up soon, so feel free to look our YouTube channel for the recordings of these past events and the ones that are coming up. But thank you so much. Thank you, Heidi, and thank you, everyone, for staying all the way to the end. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.